Richard Hooker's Of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. While preachers such as Latimer attacked the establishment and suffered for it, in colloquial language, Richard Hooker defended it in the elevated style that had been developed by Renaissance humanists under the influence of Cicero and Quintilian. His Of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity illustrates the periodic sentence structure and Latinate vocabulary that characterized this style. Latinate phrases such as intermit her course and irregular volubility give his prose a slow, dignified movement. This world's first creation and the preservation since of things created, what is it but only so far forth a manifestation by execution what the eternal law of God is concerning things natural? And as it cometh to pass in a kingdom rightly ordered, that after a law is once published, it presently takes effect far and wide, all states framing themselves thereunto. Even so let us think it fareth in the natural course of the world, since the time that God did first proclaim the edicts of his law upon it, heaven and earth have hearkened unto his voice, and their labour hath been to do his will. He made a law for the Rhine, he gave his decree unto the sea, that the waters should not pass his commandment. Now, if nature should intermit her course, and leave altogether, though it were but for a while, the observation of her own laws, if those principal and mother elements of the world, whereof all things in this lower world are made, should lose the qualities which now they have, if the frame of that heavenly arch erected over our heads should loosen and dissolve itself, if celestial spheres should forget their wonted motions, and by irregular volubility turn themselves any way as it might happen, if the prince of the lights of heaven, which now as a giant doth run his unwearied course, should, as it were, through a languishing faintness, begin to stand and to rest himself, if the moon should wander from her beaten way, the times and seasons of the year blend themselves by disordered and confused mixture, the winds breathe out their last gasp, the clouds yield no rain, the earth be defeated of heavenly influence, the fruits of the earth pine away as children at the withered breasts of their mother, no longer able to yield them relief. What would become of man himself, whom these things now do all serve? Say we not plainly that obedience of creatures unto the law of nature is the stay of the whole world? The King James Bible. One of the great things to come out of the religious disputes of the 16th and 17th centuries was, of course, the King James Bible. It was compiled by more than 50 clergymen and scholars representing both the Anglican and Puritan wings of the Church. The classical training of these men, the artistry of their original Greek and Hebrew texts, and the heritage of English religious prose all the way back to Anglo-Saxon times, all these things combined to produce the magnificent style of the King James Bible. But notice that there are many styles in the Bible. We might contrast, for example, the simplicity, the plain Anglo-Saxon vocabulary of one passage from the New Testament, from the book of Luke, and the skillful and elaborate use of parallel structure and high rhetoric in another passage from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. The King James Bible, Luke, book 15, verses 11 and following. And he said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. And when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him, and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck, and kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, Bring forth the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead, and is alive again. He was lost, and is found. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 1 and following. Though I spake with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, and have no charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity suffereth long, and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth. But whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. Richard Hakluyt's Divers Voyages touching the discovery of America. Another major development during the Elizabethan age was the discovery and exploration of North America. Richard Hakluyt tried to encourage colonization by publishing various travel narratives, including his Divers Voyages touching the discovery of America. This work was meant to serve as a manual for potential colonists. Some of the words illustrate semantic changes that have taken place since the early modern period, when card, for example, meant map, when plant could be a synonym for settle, and seat could mean a colony. This year the king, by means of a Venetian, which made himself very expert and cunning in knowledge of the circuit of the world and islands of the same, as by a card and other demonstrations reasonable he shewed, caused to men and victual a ship at Bristol, to search for an island which he said he knew well, was rich and replenished with rich commodities. Which ship thus manned and victualled at the king's cost, divers merchants of London ventured in her small stocks, being in her as chief patron the said Venetian, and in the company of the said ship sailed also out of Bristol 3 or 4 small ships frocked with freight and gross merchandises, as coarse cloth, caps, laces, points, and other trifles, and so departed from Bristol in the beginning of May, of whom in this Mayer's time returned no tidings. This year also were brought unto the king 3 men taken in the Newfound Island, that before I spake of, in William Purchas' time being mayor. These were clothed in beast skins, and ate raw flesh, and spake such speech that no man could understand them, and in their demeanour like to brute beasts, whom the king kept a time after. Of the which upon 2 years past after, I saw 2 apparelled after the manner of Englishmen in Westminster Palace, which at that time I could not discern from Englishmen, till I was learned what they were. But as for speech, I heard none of them utter one word. John Smith's General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles. The first colonists to settle in America were Elizabethan Englishmen. Like many of these early settlers, John Smith came from the East Midlands and had received some grammar school education. He sailed to Virginia in 1607 with the first expedition sent out by the Royal Virginia Company of London. His General History was the first publication that claimed to be a history of English territory in the New World. In the following selection, he discusses the customs of the Indians and provides English spellings for some of their words. Although the country people be very barbarous, yet have they amongst them such government as that their magistrates for good commanding and their people for due subjection and obeying excel many places that would be counted very civil. The form of their commonwealth is a monarchical government. One as emperor ruleth over many kings or governors. Their chief ruler is called Powhatan, and taketh his name of his principal place of dwelling called Powhatan. But his proper name is Wahunsanakuk. Some countries he hath which have been his ancestors, and came unto him by inheritance, as the country called Powhatan, Arohatek, Appomattox, Pamunkey, Yochtanund, and Mattapanient. All the rest of his territories expressed in the map, they report have been his several conquests. In all his ancient inheritances, he hath houses built after their manner like arbours, some 30, some 40 yards long, and at every house provision for his entertainment according to the time. At Wirocomoko, on the north side of the river Pamunkey, was his residence, when I was delivered him prisoner some 14 miles from Jamestown, where for the most part he was resident. But at last he took so little pleasure in our near neighbourhood that he retired himself to Oropakis, in the desert, betwixt Chickamauhanta and Yochtanund. He is of parsonage a tall, well-proportioned man, with a sour look, his head somewhat grey, his beard so thin that it seemeth none at all. His age near 60, and of a very able and hardy body to endure any labour. About his person ordinarily attendeth a guard of 40 or 50 of the tallest men his country doth afford. Every night, upon the 4 quarters of his house, are 4 sentinels, each from other a flight shoot, and at every half hour one from the corps de garde doth halloo, shaking his lips with his finger between them, unto whom every sentinel doth answer round from his stand. If any fail, they presently send forth an officer that beateth them extremely. He nor any of his people understand any letters, whereby to write or read, only the laws whereby he ruleth his custom. Yet when he listeth, his will is a law and must be obeyed. Not only as a king, but as half a god they esteem him. His inferior kings, whom they call werorances, are tied to rule by customs, and hath power of life and death at their command in that nature. But this word, wererants, which we call and construe for a king, is a common word, whereby they call all commanders, for they have but few words in their language, and but few occasions to use any officers more than one commander, which commonly they call wererants, or cockeraus, which is captain. William Bradford's History of Plymouth Plantation. William Bradford, son of a Yorkshire farmer, sailed to America aboard the Mayflower in 1620. His History of Plymouth Plantation traces the fortunes of that colony from 1620 to 1647. One of his most vivid descriptions is the following one of the Pilgrims' hazardous landing at Plymouth. Notice his mingling of indirect and direct discourse when he reports the exhortations of the sailors. After some hours' sailing, it began to snow and rain, and about the middle of the afternoon the wind increased, and the sea became very rough, and they broke their rudder, and it was as much as two men could do to steer her with a couple of oars. But their pilot bade him be of good cheer, for he saw the harbour. But the storm increasing, and night drawing on, they bought what sail they could to get in, while they could see. But herewith they broke their mast in 3 paces, and their sail fell overboard in a very grown sea, so as they had like to have been cast away. Yet, by God's mercy, they recovered themselves, and having a flood with them, struck into the harbour. But when it came to, the pilot was deceived in the place, and said, The Lord be merciful unto them, for his eyes never saw that place before. And he and the master mate would have run her ashore in a cove full of breakers before the wind. But a lusty seaman which steered bade those which rowed, if they were men, about with her, or else they were all cast away, the which they did with spade. So he bid them be of good cheer and row lustily, for there was a fair sound before them, and he doubted not but they should find one place or other where they might ride in safety. And though it was very dark, and rained sore, yet in the end they got under the lee of a small island, and remained there all that night in safety. But they knew not this to be an island till morning, but were divided in their minds. Some would keep the boat for fear they might be amongst the Indians. Others were so weak and cold they could not endure, but got ashore, and with much ado got fire, our things being so wet. And the rest were glad to come to them. For after midnight the wind shifted to the northwest, and it froze hard. But though this had been a day and night of much trouble and danger unto them, yet God gave them a morning of comfort and refreshing, as usually he doth to his children. For the next day was a fair, sun-shining day, and they found themselves to be on an island secure from the Indians, where they might dry their stuff, fix their paces, and rest themselves, and gave God thanks for his mercies in their manifold deliverances. And this being the last day of the week, they prepared there to keep the Sabbath. On Monday they sounded the harbour, and found it fit for shipping, and marched into the land, and found divers cornfields and little running brooks, a place, as they supposed, fit for situation. At least it was the best they could find, and the season, and their present necessity, made them glad to accept of it. So they returned to their ship again with this news to the rest of their people, which did much comfort their hearts. Plymouth Records. The local records of Plymouth tell us something about the business conducted in town meetings, but rather more about the dialect spoken in the colony. Since the clerks who kept these records had little formal training, they often spelled words as they sounded. The spelling in the following selection reveals, for example, a continuing traditional British pronunciation of lieutenant, where the later American pronunciation was based upon standardized spelling. But here you will notice also some phonetic spellings of what we think of as New England pronunciations. Appointed for appointed. Road for road, and so on. Meeting of 1667. The town have agreed that a lean-to and a cellar shall be made and erected to the minister's house, to be about half the length of the house, it being left unto Lieutenant Morton and Sergeant Harlow to agree with workmen to do it, as they shall judge most convenient. Meeting of 1701. At said meeting, Nathaniel Warren was chosen to gather the money that is due from particular persons relating to the schooling their children the last year. At said meeting, the town voted to sell a parcel of meadow near unto William Ellis for to defraying public charge, and gave power to the selectmen to sell it for the ends aforesaid. At said meeting, George Morton, Ephraim Morton, Nathaniel Morton, Josiah Finney, Benjamin Warren, Ebenezer Holmes, and Thomas Faunce requested of the town that in case they can make a stream from the great south pond, so-called, into the brook that runneth through Finney's meadows into the Ale River, in order to the letting up alewives into said pond, that the town would grant them the privilege of 2 or 3 pole breadth on each side of said stream, of land down along said stream so far as the town commons goeth, which said request was granted to them, and to stop the pond when it needs. At said meeting, the selectmen, or any 2 of them, are appointed to lay out a highway from the Sandy Hill to Lakenham, and from Sandwich Road 1.5 miles over double brooks towards Agawam.